wisely, without a doubt or question. Responding to fan mail was part of Roger's very regimented daily routine, which began at 5 a.m. with a prayer and included time for studying, writing, making phone calls, swimming, weighing himself, and responding to every fan who had taken time to reach out to him. Heather Arnett, an assistant on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, said, "He respected the kids who wrote those letters. He never thought about throwing away a drawing or a letter. He thought they were all sacred." According to Arnett, the fan mail he received wasn't just a bunch of young kids gushing to their idol. Kids would tell Rogers about a pet or a family member who died and other issues they were grappling with. No child ever received a form letter from Mr. Rogers, even though he got 50 to 100 letters a day. It wasn't just kids and their parents who loved Mr. Rogers. Coco, the Stanford-educated gorilla who understands 200 English words and can also converse in American Sign Language, was an avid Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood fan. When Mr. Rogers visited her, she immediately gave him a hug and took off his sneakers. Mr. Rogers was an ordained Presbyterian minister and as such, a man of tremendous faith who preached tolerance wherever he went. He graduated magna cum laude from Rollins College with a degree in music. In addition to being a talented piano player, he was also a wonderful songwriter and wrote all the songs for Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, plus hundreds more. They are songs that become what my grandchildren call earworms, which means a catchy piece of music that continually repeats through a person's mind over and over again. How many of you are going to go home today humming "It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood"? Mr. Rogers' decision to enter into television wasn't out of a passion for the medium, far from it. He told the Pittsburgh Magazine, "When I first saw children's television, I thought it was perfectly horrible. And I thought there was some way of using this fabulous medium to nurture those who would watch and listen," and he did. A Yale study pitted fans of Sesame Street against Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood watchers and found the kids who watched Mr. Rogers tended to remember more of the storylines and had a much higher tolerance of delay, meaning they were more patient. Can you say patience? I knew you could. In 1969, Mr. Rogers, who was relatively unknown at the time, went before the Senate to plead for $20 million in a grant for public broadcasting, which had been proposed by President Johnson, but was in danger of being sliced in half by Richard Nixon. His passionate plea about how television had the potential to turn kids into productive citizens worked. Instead of cutting the budget, funding for public TV increased from $9 million to $22 million. Years later, Mr. Rogers also managed to convince the Supreme Court that using VCRs to record TV shows at home should not be considered a form of copyright infringement, which was the argument. Mr. Rogers argued that recording a program like his allowed working parents to sit down with their children and watch shows as a family. Again, he was convincing. If watching an episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood gives you sweater envy, I've got bad news. You'll never be able to find his sweaters in a store. All of those comfy-looking sweaters, the little cardigans, were knitted by his mom, Nancy. In an interview with the Archive of American Television, Mr. Rogers explained how his mother would knit sweaters for all of her loved ones every year as Christmas gifts. And so she did until she died, Those zippered sweaters that I wear on the neighborhood were all made by my mother, Mr. Rogers said. In 1984, Rogers donated one of his iconic sweaters to the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, where it is right now. And I think it's the red one. That was everyone's favorite. Those brightly colored sweaters were a trademark of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, but the colorblind host might not have always noticed. He was colorblind. He was so colorblind he could not distinguish between tomato soup and pea soup. He liked both, but at lunch one day 50 years ago, he asked his television partner, Josie Carey, to taste it for him and tell him which one it was. Why did he need her to do this, Miss Carey asked him. Mr. Rogers liked both, so why not just dip in? If it's tomato soup, he told her, I'll put sugar in it. And if we're talking about his dressing habits, let's talk about his sneakers. Mr. Rogers' decision to change into sneakers for each episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was about production, not comfort. His trademark sneakers were born when he found them to be quieter than his dress shoes. The dress shoes he wore had too heavy a step for behind-the-scenes work when he worked with the puppets. The canvas shoes allowed Mr. Rogers to walk around backstage, maneuvering his puppets without a sound. Those puppets helped Mr. Rogers teach lessons to children from the everyday mundane issues to the scary and unimaginable. When faced with images of death and hate and disaster on TV, Mr. Rogers gave children the advice his mother gave him. When I was a boy, he said, I would see scary things in the news, and my mother would say to me, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. One of my favorite quotes from Mr. Rogers is, if only you can sense how important you are to the lives of those you meet, how important you can be to people you may never even dream of. There is something of yourself that you leave at every meeting with another person. All of us have special people who have loved us into being. Close your eyes. Picture those people from your life in your mind. Do you have them pictured? Now take just 10 seconds in your mind to thank them. All those who have cared about you and wanted what was best for you in your life. Just 10 seconds. I'll count it. Mr. Rogers says, I believe that appreciation is a holy thing, that when we look for what's best in a person we happen to be with at the moment, we are doing what God does all the time. So in loving and appreciating our neighbor, we are participating in something sacred. We live in a world in which we need to share responsibility. It's easy to say, it's not my child, it's not my community, not my world, not my problem. Then there are those who see the need and respond. Mr. Rogers considered these people his heroes. Let us embrace our own responsibilities, our own heroes, as we take a quiet moment to reflect. The bell will lead us into meditation, and the music will lead us out. Janine. We will now give and receive an offering to support and sustain this congregation, all the ministries we serve inside these walls and outside in a larger world. Our offertory music is a gift to us from Janine Brobst. Thank you. We are grateful for all you freely give. We have another song, of course, because this is Mr. Rogers. On your insert is the song Tomorrow. So please stand if you are willing or able, and we will all sing Tomorrow. Everybody, as you're standing, hold hands. Let's see if we can connect this whole congregation and all the visitors. Well, you girls want the... Did you turn? Return in love. Blessed be.